Hello, welcome to In His Will. My name's Debbie Bird Smith,
And my name's Larry Leopold.
and we're so happy that you could join us today on In His Will. And today we're talking about, we've been talking the last few weeks about saints, and specifically Carmelite saints, and the divine will, and all that we can learn. We don't want to throw the babies out with the bathwater. We have this long, long history of saints that we have so much to gain from and glean from, and uh, uh, follow in our journey in the divine will. And so we wanted to dive a little deeper, and we started with the Carmelites. And today we have a very special Carmelite, the great reformer, big Teresa, Theresa of Avila.
Amen. And as the one of the original mystical doctors of the church, her and her compadre, St. John of the Cross, really charted out a map for us on how this spiritual journey occurs, which the church, after in the very beginning, was very suspicious of such activity, but partly because of the Reformation and the great enthusiasm that movement spawned of people who would do their own interior journey. That a lot of the reformers, including Saint Ignatius, were brought before the Inquisition, right? And John of the Cross had a moment, right? Until the church could understand this is authentic and in the tradition of the magisterial of the church, and it's just new information for us. So thank God she was an icebreaker, finding the Northwest Passage.
She really, really was, and there's so much with this great, great woman of the church, and the great saint of the church. That there's a lot of treasure there to dig into. But first, I just wanted to give those who may not be familiar with Teresa a little bit of background on her. She's was born in 1515, so this was um, uh, really a time of great. Obviously, it was many centuries ago, but it was also a time of some great. Came into a time of great turmoil in the church, but she grew up in a very pious family. She is one of 12 children. She was one of 12 children. She had two sisters and nine brothers, and her parents were very pious, and in some ways her her childhood, her parentage reminds me a great deal actually of little Therese, because her parents, she describes her parents as extraordinarily her father is a man of extraordinary integrity. She never heard him tell a lie. She never heard him really do anything that was anything less than gentlemanly and kind. Her mother she described as very beautiful and deeply serene. She must have been serene, because to be serene with 12 children uh, is not is not that easy. And as a child, she talked about um, growing up with that many brothers and sisters, and she described her younger brother, who I think was the next younger to her, how she and her, this is all in her autobiography, which I would encourage anyone to read. It's wonderful. She's written some really great books, and her autobiography in itself is just a wonderful book. But she describes her sort of her spiritual journey beginning with her brother, and when she was about 6 years old, and they decided that they were going to be saints at 6 years old. She really says that's really when uh, my spiritual awakening started at 6. And so my brother and I decided that we were going to run off and conquer the Moors and beg them to chop off our heads. She said, "For God's sakes, chop off our heads." And she said they only had one thing that really stopped them from doing that, and that was the fact that they had parents. So
Well,
apparently her mother and father sullied their idea of going off and running off and having their house for their kids.
well, on that point too, I just like to also uh, let it be known that she is very much also like us in America, in our culture, how she grew up, because as as wonderful as her father was and the good example he showed, all right, he had a secret habit, all right? He had a little thing that he would do and he would hide. He loved books of chivalry. You say, my gosh, is that a horrible
I
thing?
didn't know that because her mother had one that she had as well.
So she picked up the hidden books and they became like her avid reading thing. All right. And so she regrets that later, she says, but and I have to associate, I love movies about war and men enduring hardship, as did Saint Ignatius, by the way, right?
Well, obviously she was from a family of money.
Yeah,
This was a well-to-do family because we're talking about the 1500s here,
yeah.
and she talks about her father that they had books, and he had these books because he wanted his children to read, and this is obviously an experience that only the upper class would experience because people were trying to eat. They didn't buy books. But her mother had an addiction to romance novels. And they tried to hide, and their father hated it, and so they would hide the romance novels from dad. But she developed this addiction as well, and she said that she was very discontent if she was reading one and didn't have one in backup for when she finished that one. It became what she described as a raging addiction. And whereas her mother could read them and enjoy them, and it gave her an escape from 12 children,
Yeah.
hers really became a problem. And so, and I think it just goes to show that even things as,
Yeah.
as
And
simple as a book can really distract us.
and that's her
Not
point
movies
too.
or anything then, it was books, it was.
Yeah, it wasn't evil, and she didn't say it was sinful. All right. But what she did notice was that even those things which, in a sense, she tried to do God and the world,
Yes.
and doing the two slowed down her progress,
Mhm.
which she noted later. And again, as we say, wished she hadn't. All right. All right. Even though I imagine that the very regret that she had as a result of having other interests and loves besides Jesus at
Mhm.
that point, that suffering that she experienced in the recollection that that's what she was doing is what also propelled her to such great desire for high holiness.
Exactly, because she did have tremendous regrets. And her, this great zeal that she felt as a child, sort of morphed into this um, obsession with worldliness, and she was very concerned with, she was beautiful. She was considered a very beautiful woman. Her mother was considered a very beautiful woman. Her mother died when she was 12, and so this was a very pivotal age for her to have died at this time and left a father with 12 children. um, and so this was very, very difficult for her, because she had to sort of come into womanhood without that guidance of her mother. Fortunately, she had her sisters, and her sisters were helpful. But she says that as she grew older and she became more and more concerned with the world and with, she says in her book that she was forbidden. She was ordered to write the book. She laments in the book she didn't want to write it. Um, and that she really laments the fact that she wasn't able to tell people how truly wicked she was. She describes herself as wicked, um, and very sinful, and that she never did anything to really jeopardize her salvation, but apparently she came very close. And but she said, I was just so concerned with the world, and how she said I was obsessed with how I looked and smelled and seemed, that everything had to be, it was all about the outer person, and it was all about how she was perceived, and that this obsession really with how she was perceived was what really saved her from stepping completely over the line, because she would never want to have been thought of as something low, or really embarrass herself.
Yeah.
But she was just close enough that she was tottering this line of God and the world, and she walked that line and teetered that line for a while, didn't she?
Yeah. So we think in terms of the divine will, she really was struggling here with self, right? And all the things of self. In the beginning, she basically gave into it all, right? And was subject to it. But again, like Little Flower would tell us, the repentant heart always loves God infinitely more than the innocent heart that never sinned. And so we see this in this Teresa, about how important her early failings were in terms of her future growth. All right, and so this is a great comfort for all of us.
There
In our
is.
culture,
Amen
our,
to that.
yeah, our culture does not encourage complete innocence and purity by any means. Right, so don't be dismayed. In fact, she would say in some of her things, not to be overly concerned about all that. Right, but go on. Tell us more about her beginnings there.
Well, she had she said that maybe she would have not fallen so far off the track. However, there was a cousin that came to live with them, and she said, which really disturbed her mother. She said she thought her mother could see that she was a very bad influence on her, but the circumstances were such that she had to be there. The cousin had to be there, and for whatever reason, due to some kind of family, whatever it was, this cousin had to come and live with them. And this cousin obviously didn't have come from the kind of environment that Teresa had been uh, raised in. And so she introduced her to this idea of all these worldly pleasures that they could dabble their toes in. And, I kind of see her as this sort of the wild cousin, and some of us have them, the wild cousin that, oh, they're going to teach you, they're going to, let's step out here a little bit. But um, she was really always bothered by this, because there was always this attachment that she had to God. She had thought about being a nun, actually, from the time that she was young, and she really never considered marriage. Um,
Actually, she was afraid of it.
she just, that was just not the thing for her. And I think part of that may very well have been, of course, large families were very common then. Um, and what a tremendous responsibility, what a burden that could appear, particularly to a young girl. Her mother died very young. She was 33 when she died. And so it absolutely held no appeal for her whatsoever. So
And
what
yeah,
really left to
I
her?
could I could really see that too. If she became like the surrogate mom at a young age, then you could really understand how she was ready to run. It's just like a lot of work here,
Well,
right?
it's funny because my parents' best friends were a couple who had 12 children. And I saw what a family of 12 looked like, very, very up close and personal. These people have been, their children have been my brothers and my friends for a very long time. The oldest daughter, whose name was Ruth, said, "I will never have children. I will never have a child." And she didn't. She
Yeah,
didn't,
yeah.
because she was the oldest girl, and the older children took care of the younger children. And that's very typical in how it works with a large family. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing, but particularly for the very oldest children, maybe they kind of get enough of it that, Teresa was like, nah, I don't, this holds no appeal for me whatsoever. But strangely enough, entering a convent did.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
and I think that she had these high goals, these high desires of glory, All right, very much part of the Spanish culture. She would be willing to die in the field with that Spanish bravado, okay, and for God, and vainglory, and was very close in her spirituality as well in her early years. In fact, she was attracted to a particular convent because she thought that this and that particular nuns that she became close to were very attractive, and she wanted to be with them because she loved friendships.
Yes. But she did love friendships, and she was very gregarious. She was very social. She does, and I think again to get a feel for the for the culture of the time, particularly in Spain. This idea of being religious was very much a part of their culture. She talks about when she and her younger brother couldn't run off to the mortis and have their heads cut off. Um, they decided to become hermits, and they had a sort of an orchard in their backyard. And so they went back in the orchard. This was still when they were small children, and they would pile up rocks trying to build little hermitages so they could live in the backyard and be hermits. But unfortunately, the rocks kept falling down, and it didn't really work out. So she just was laughing about her frustration of being young and wanting to be a saint and wanting to give her life to God, and they just got frustrated at every turn. And then when she expressed this idea of becoming a nun,
Ah, yeah,
yeah, that
yeah.
didn't go over real well.
Not with dad, but
Not with
in as you point out, in the culture, the religious life was much higher than the idea of a lay person having a family. Okay, a lay person having a family was considered, yeah, well, they don't love God as much, right?
mm,
And so for her, again, her personal Spanish zeal to die for God, all right, uh, which a lot of self and a lot of human will in that mixed in with the great graces of it. It was a mixed bag, right? But we and in our time now, where the laity are now having the baton passed to us
mhm.
to achieve that spiritual height in our families during work, right? uh, this is now useful for us, but we have to translate a lot of what she said into our lifestyle, which
We
we
do.
hope to be doing, right?
Well, and we do, and I think one of the things that is so telling about, the time that she lived in as compared to the time that we live now, um, the religious life was very different then.
Yeah.
And this is where the Great Reform came in. And I'm sure we'll talk a lot about the Great Reform and how Teresa and John of the Cross really worked to reform the Carmelite order, because religious life then was considered a higher calling, but it was also pretty cushy compared to what it is now. In fact, ladies of a higher society many times would enter the convent, especially if they became widowed or they were wealthy women. Um, but the way they lived in the convent was nothing like the Carmelites lived after the Reform. And uh, but she had a sister, her sister Juana, who really her sister Juana would have loved. She said when she became ill, we'll talk about that. She became very, very ill. She went to live with her sister Juana and her brother-in-law, and she said if it was up to her, I would have never left. She would have kept me with her forever. And so she had this strong, strong pull of family, very strong family ties. But she was determined. And he finally, her father finally kind of gave up, I think, on holding her back. She got old enough. I think she went into the convent at 21. Uh,
Yes.
so she was older. And I think he just gave up the fight. He couldn't really hold her back anymore. She was of an age where he could certainly verbalize his objections, but
Yeah.
he didn't have the hold on her that he had really as uh, a father saying no, no, no.
Yeah.
Uh,
So as she went into the convent now, all right, convent life was not like what what the discounts made it. All right. Convent life was kind of cushy, as you point out, right? And a lot of friendships, a lot of people coming to visit. A lot of her stuff came with her. As wealthy girls would bring all their stuff with them. All right, and
including their
servants.
dogs, including their dogs, their
Yeah,
maids, their everything. It was their special chairs, their furniture, and it was sort
yeah.
of an open door, wasn't it? People came
Well,
and
which was great for the wealthy. All
yeah.
right, but the poor girls who were sent to the nunnery, right, by the parents who didn't have any money, they would be in the next cell over, having bread for dinner.
Sleeping
you
on
know,
boards.
yeah. And so it was nutty, but that's where she came in. And as she entered the convent, we see the beginnings of her health issue, her whole life, right? And talk about a little bit of her conditions as she first started her journey in the convent, Debbie.
Well, they
All
were,
right, as she suffered.
well, she became ill. Is that what you're talking about, Larry, when she
Yeah,
became ill?
yeah,
She became very ill, and they didn't know what was wrong with her. But she described it as uh, just this extraordinary pain in every part of her body. She had muscle aches and her back hurt, and she got to a point where she couldn't walk. She had to, it was quite a while before she could even crawl. And they actually took her out of the convent and took her, I believe, to her sisters with one of the other nuns came with her and was tended to because they just couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. And so this went on for quite a while, for about 8 months, close to a year. She was really bedridden, and then she got to a point where she could crawl, and then she got to a point where she could walk
yeah,
badly.
yeah,
And so she spent this period of very poor health early on in her journey. And I think it came to the point where she said, just let me die. But she describes this period of time as extraordinarily molding in her spirituality, because she learned firsthand about suffering
yeah,
and what suffering could do for your soul,
yeah,
for
yeah,
your attention. Um,
yeah,
she couldn't stand to be touched. She had a very difficult time uh, being on a bed or laying down. She was just in terrible, excruciating pain all the time, and nobody could touch her. She couldn't eat. She the When she left to go to her sisters to be cared for, when heard, the nuns in the convent heard that she was coming back, they expected that she was going to be coming back to be put in a coffin. They thought that she was dead, and they were amazed when she came back and she was still alive. She was still in terrible, terrible condition, but they didn't expect her to be alive at all. And this is how bad it had gotten, how badly she suffered.
and it indicated as well how strong her will was, that she muscled through, soldiered through, shall we say, in her Spanish bravado or macho woman here, that she suffered like various things, all different things, all her life.
Yeah.
And her advice, of course, through all of that was, don't pay over much attention to your body,
Mhm.
to your health. All right, that this too can be a distraction that can hinder your spiritual growth. Right, you do what you have to do, you get through it, but don't complain.
Yeah.
Almost, just pay no attention. Right, and so this became a signature, I guess, of how she was able to move through various sufferings.
Well,
Right?
she was of the mind of, well, Jesus suffered. Why should I be any different? This is I'm living my life
Yeah,
mirroring Jesus, and
yeah.
that's okay. We can do it. We can deal with it.
Now, as we say this now, and we just kind of bring it in a little bit more about how she started to learn about prayer. when she first got into the convent, it doesn't sound like she was like deep into prayer. In fact, she didn't even like it. She didn't like.
I don't think anybody was deep into prayer.
No,
It was more,
no.
it was more like a tea party, you know?
That's right. And you did the vocal prayer with everybody else, and she was doing the bare necessities
Mhm.
for years. I think for like 21 years, she really didn't do mental prayer because she didn't care for it. She didn't have an imagination for it. It was hard for her, made her tired. So she stuck to the minimum, all right? Which of course, here's the great mystical doctor of the church, right?
Yeah.
21 years or so, 17 years, I think it was, before she started even attempting with any real conviction mental prayer. Right? Great encouragement for those of us who are late starters, right?
It's great hope. It gives me great hope, doesn't it? Yeah, it gives you great hope.
Right. And then as she started, she still had, and this is kind of the long view, she started doing mental prayer and she applied herself with great diligence finally, as she does with those things she's ready to do. She meditated for another almost 20 years and didn't advance. And she was like, "What is up with that?" Right? And so she's doing even contemplative prayer, all these different prayers
Mhm.
with no progress in her spiritual journey. And finally, she went to a confessor who taught her that if you're just doing even that high contemplative prayer, but you're not practicing virtues, you're not going to grow. And so she wrote in her book that you'll become a spiritual dwarf if you're not living the virtues, right? Which we can do right from the beginning, right? And she learned at the end. So that was an outrageously important part for us to understand. Again, as us Carmelites, can get caught in the contemplative portion of our vocation. But if you're not loving your neighbor,
And this is, and I just have to stop and say, and this is why um, we have to pay attention. We have the divine will. What a wonderful gift! This is the greatest gift we could have been given. But these things that we can learn about advancing in virtue from the saints
yeah,
is so important because
yeah,
we can never come to think that just our prayer or just, okay, I offer my works. We have to advance in virtue. We have to advance in our love of God. This is what it's all about. And our virtue is what emanates from that love of God and how important that is. And so,
that's right.
it's a great example of we can do all the right things and still not really advance in this love, this closeness, this mission of God that He's given to us to love and
Yeah,
to be uh, one with Him
yeah,
in our mission, our work here on this plane, on this earth, in this kingdom.
yeah,
And 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 so, one of the things that I've learned, and this was something that I digress here just a little bit, but this is one of the things that I picked up, in my journey in the divine will is this is beautiful and this is wonderful. But if I'm still the same person that I was coming into this, I should be advancing in virtue. I should be advancing in love. I should be advancing in these virtues of kindness and patience and gentleness and love and these attributes and boldness and speaking out. All of these virtues that we find in our great saints that God has given us these great examples. And what a great example Teresa is that she went all these years in prayer, even contemplative prayer. And,
yeah.
you know,
And I don't know if you were with us in a couple of years ago as we do a course on virtues for those in the
yes,
divine will. All
I
right.
was, yeah.
All right. So
Yeah,
we'll be doing that
it
again
was a
coming this
long time,
summer.
really.
It's been a while, hasn't
It's
it?
been a while, yeah.
Right. So it's time for another round of that for all those who join us now. But this journey into virtues now really helped the graces of her prayer time uh, bear fruit, and she started soaring in her journey. All right. But just as we come to our time closing up here, I wanted to just uh, talk about the simple things that she talked about, 4 degrees of prayer. And she called them the 4 waters of prayer, which is wonderfully dumbed down for us beginners, if you wish, right? On,
Thank God.
on I'll take it,
Take
prayer
it.
for dummies, right?
Thanks, yeah.
And she did, and she just had a lovely allegory, which I hope for us to go degree by degree through these 4, what she called waters of prayer, that she was now giving us the allegory of a gardener in our prayer life. And as you're trying to tend your garden, and she says in the beginning, you have to pull out all the weeds, right? But then you have to water the plants so that they grow. And she says, how you water the plants become the 4 waters. And so if we can just take a moment to go through those, we'll be talking about these in detail in the coming weeks. Is that okay with you, Debbie?
I
Right?
think that's wonderful because, we have so much more to talk about. This kind of really lays the groundwork.
And she is the master. She is, all right. So she says that you can draw water from a well, all right. And she said this is how beginners begin, all right. And she said it's very laborious, right, because you have to take a bucket, put it on a rope, dip it down into the well. You have to haul it back up, and you bucket by bucket, you bring it back to the plant. She said very fatiguing and yet important beginning process, which you would actually uh, uh, connect with meditation. Okay. Then the second water could be by means of a water wheel. All right. Buckets that would be worked along ropes, and this is, of course, 15th century technology, mind you, but the idea that mechanically you could have the water drawn from a stream, brought like a irrigation system over to your plants. Again, so this is a help and an aid, and so it's less laborious than the
Hmm.
bucket brigade, but it brings up more water, which is also helpful for the growing of the plant. And then the third watering, she said, comes if you plant your garden next to a stream or a spring, because the water will be more moist. It's closer at hand. Everything grows better in that proximity to the water. Of course, in the water we know is God's grace, right? And then finally she says, or, and this is a great big or here, or you can just let heavy rain water your plants, right? By letting the Lord water them himself without any labor on our part. And this, of course, is the best method of all. The question is how to get there. And so as we come next week, we'll begin with that first one of how do we do the well? Because some we have to do by ourselves. And that's how we begin the process with our own efforts. As we say in the divine will, you can do it with the human will, all right? And you initiate this desire, which God sees as your interest and sincerity in growth, which he will then answer with the graces that move us to the other waterings, the higher prayer, the greater graces of a prayer time, right? And so stay tuned next week as we go there, right, Bevy?
Yes, yes. I look forward to that. And I hope that you'll join us next week as we go deeper into Teresa of Avila. Thank you
Amen.
all. Amen.
All right. See you next week.
See you
See
next
ya.
week.